The New York Football Giants make it official, bringing back Daniel Jones on the 4-year contract. And we hear from Daniel Jones and Joe Schoen. The more interesting of the two conversations is from the New York GM. Some thoughts around getting Daniel Jones inked on the 4-year deal and how it impacts Saquon Barkley and big decisions that they can make moving forward in this offseason. We dive into the conversation next. Yes, everybody. It's OGP, the One Giant Podcast, coming in for another back-to-back days with lives on YouTube. Obviously, because we knew that the deadline for the potential tag was looming yesterday. The Giants got that deal done with Daniel Jones. We discussed it. And then today we hear from both Daniel Jones and from GM Joe Schoen. Before we tap all the way into it, a quick shout-out over in the chat there, man. Cy Guy Bry, holy, and you know what? You get it thrown up here because you did the great thing. You went ahead and kept it clean for YouTube, kept it clean for the podcast. Fantastic to have you in here, man. Dr. Pancake as well. Big day for Big Blue yesterday. In Joe we trust. You better believe it. So, listen, we'll talk about a little bit about Daniel Jones and his comments. There's not a lot there. And really, the comments from Joe Schoen are more interesting about what this team can do going forward now, and specifically some other players that are certainly in discussions around whether releasing, restructuring contracts or extending contracts. So just on the Daniel Jones stuff, there's nothing there. Talks about it, you had to trust the process, made the switch to the new representation, believed he was going to get there, wanted to be here. The most interesting thing, I'll put it in his camp as opposed to for Joe Schoen, was that Daniel Jones was in the building, like showing up and putting in work while the negotiations were going on. So from that standpoint, I just think, and for the most part, I know yesterday I spent a lot of time saying, hey, here's the speculative what if scenarios, different things, maybe debating around where Daniel Jones' value should be. But ultimately, he was going to be here. And I think, the way that he talked about it was just, I need to maximize my value because this is my opportunity to do so. And we've spoken a lot about that of late. I think that Joe Schoen mentioned it too, where, would you have preferred to get it done sooner? Yes. Said that he set kind of, hey, could we do a noon deadline here on Tuesday? That didn't work out. Most of it probably comes down to the language, to the incentives, to the Giants wanting flexibility in the short term in terms of the cap hit, keeping it under $19 million for this upcoming season, 82, maybe 86 million. The number's off the top of my head there as far as the guaranteed money over the first 2 years. So there is that security there in that sense. But by and large, Daniel Jones kept it very plain, very simple, wanted to be here, had to trust the process, all that good stuff. And he also skirted the conversation just around the impact that can have on Saquon Barkley or other players and moves this team can make. He said, obviously, that's important. He respects Saquon, loves playing with Saquon, and hopefully those things work out. But we get it. Like, these are business discussions that need to go on, and that's the way both sides seem to handle it. Now, if we turn our attention over to the Joe Schoen side of this thing, it was, and they mentioned this maybe in both iterations of it, talking with Daniel and then talking with Joe, where Joe Schoen, who saw Daniel Jones in the hallway, he said, oh, did you communicate anything? It was, it's going to get worse before it gets better in terms of having to go through these types of negotiations. It's the first big negotiation for Daniel Jones in his NFL career. Joe Schoen also mentioned, as an assistant GM with Buffalo, being able to go through this from a QB perspective, knowing that that's one of the most difficult negotiations to have as a GM. As the assistant GM, they went through that with Allen. So he felt like he had some sense of what this process was going to look like, some of the speed bumps you're going to walk into here, and that ultimately you were going to get it done. I'll look down here just a little bit at my notes because I want to make sure that I hit all the bullet points that I want to get to here. Franchise tag, not good for either side. We understood that. And I think, it's funny. There wasn't really a world, and we discussed this over the course of this last couple of weeks on the podcast. Name the world where they put the non-exclusive on and another team says, not only do we want to negotiate a contract with you for $38, $39, $40 million a year, but we also want to give 2 first-round picks to the Giants. So even though I think we talked about it from a non-emotional standpoint, hey, if you do that, 32 and a half, that was the worst case scenario. No one's going to negotiate for him. You don't have to worry about the market value. Comes back. You say, hey, now if you wanted to continue to have these discussions on a true extension, well, we can tell you that the market didn't want to pay you $40 million a year. Let's now back that thing down a little bit. Talked about the Derek Carr contract, talked about the Geno Smith contract, right? It just seems like this was a somewhat internal negotiation, just about what do we need to do so that we continue to be viable going forward in this offseason. Shane mentioned no one's going to get everything that they want on both sides. You understand that going into it. And they was asked about, is this now with Daniel Jones under contract, is the goal here with Daniel Jones to win a Super Bowl? And he said, yeah, that's the goal. And by the way, tell me a GM that signs a quarterback to a 4-year contract and then turns around and says, I don't know. We'll see. We'll see what happens, right? So it's not like that's like some earth-shattering news, but a lot of Joe Schoen's, I think, commentary reflecting back on the year prior, his first year as the GM, some of the restrictions they had, and now what the structure of this contract will afford them to do. They want to go out and be able to pursue some higher level guys in free agency. And we had discussed about what is this going to look like? Can they make one big splashy move on the market and then fill in the pieces? Joe Schoen at least seems to be elevating the floor of what they want to accomplish here. And there's some other reasons why that he went on to discuss here as well. We'll just check on the chat here real quick since people are in there and having a good time. We are finally on the right track. Let's go. Yeah, I mean, and listen, a part of that can be this. Now, you go inside the numbers, and it does feel like for all parties involved, there is this little kind of 2-year out. I don't think that that's a likely scenario here. I think the most likely thing is that Daniel Jones continues to develop. Year number 2, under Dable, under Kafka. They go ahead and bring in some weapons around him. They shore up both sides of the ball at key positions as best they can with the cap space they're going to have, with the draft picks they're going to have. I believe that Daniel Jones is going to continue to get progressively better. I just wonder how quickly that arc will come here for them. It's funny that when we have these discussions, I know on this podcast, it's like I've been labeled as, out of between Andy and I, and quite frankly, I am, between the two of us, the more pessimistic person when it comes to Daniel Jones. Coming into this past season, by the way, though, like if he had thrown, and maybe this is like, it's like so marginal, and if he had more talent, maybe it would have been different. But I said coming in, I'd like to see him have 25 to 30 total touchdowns. And that includes the rushing, right? Because I always believed that you could see more of that if it was being done effectively and if it was being done the right way. So when you see him have 22 total, he's not that far off from it. And a lot of the decision-making got better. The read progressions got better. And that's something that's independent of where does the ball end up when he throws it, caught, dropped, the quality of the receivers. All that stuff can be secondary. Like you can just watch and say the year prior, you didn't see him get off of his number 1 read as quickly. This past season, worked through his progressions significantly better, was better with his decision-making. So all of those things make me feel like he's going to continue to develop into a quality quarterback. He's still on the upward swing of his arc, obviously. And it's just going to be fun. It's going to be fun and fascinating to see what pieces get added here. And then, as we know, once you start to add more pieces, then those expectations start to go up. And I don't think that we're going to see some type of tragic drop-off or they add more pieces and it somehow gets worse. But it will be fun to then readjust our expectations for Daniel Jones depending on what happens on this season. Some people have also thrown out the idea, well, you're making $40 million now, and now when you go out week 1, you throw 2 interceptions in the first couple of weeks of the season in one of those games, the fan base is going to be, hey, you're getting paid this money now. Again, I still fall into the same boat of I want to see him progress. I want to see him get better. I'm not going to dump him on one bad game, one bad quarter, one bad throw, but you do want to see over the life of this contract, over this upcoming season, a quarterback that is continuing to get better. And I believe that we'll see that. One more quick tap in here. As we take a look around some of the Joe Schoen comments, and then really specifically the upcoming things here for this offseason that I found fascinating if we're going to try to pull on some of the threads from Joe Schoen. Gavin, DJ developing is going to require guys who can get open and people to protect. The mission statement hasn't changed. No, and by the way, the mission statement doesn't change if you re-sign Daniel Jones or not. If Daniel Jones was able to and walked away in free agency, the mission statement of every single NFL team is to build the, be effective on the offensive line, protect your quarterback, whoever he is, be effective on the defensive front, pressure the opposing quarterback, and then have weapons. Have weapons that affords you the ability to play effective football on a week in, week out basis. So, yeah, I think that is a good reminder here. It's like the process of making a better team is still the same process. It's always going to be that, whether it was right now in this year, whether it was before they drafted Daniel Jones, the back end of Eli's career, trying to maybe find another quarterback, a young guy you could develop, Davis Webb, all those guys, Kyle Laletta. You're trying to build and grow a talent in the background, and then also solidify all these spots. And previous regimes failed in big ways to do so. That being the case, though, the other things that I wanted to get to coming out of here when we talk about Joe Schoen and his comments. One thing he did give the little reveal around with the team inside the building for the Giants negotiating on a big contract, something that he didn't do the season prior. And he said, yeah, maybe a little bit of the personality pieces that came out that people inside the building weren't aware of is I can get a little stubborn, because he was, as every GM needs to, even if you love the player you're trying to bring back, he is still going to try to dig his heels in around, well, the cap hit can't be X, right? The guaranteed money can't be Y. I need to look at this as the GM and say, 2 years from now, where will we be? 3 years, 4 years, where will we be? And then he did get into some of the other conversations that can happen this offseason, whether it's in-house guys and then also going to free agency as well. The big one for me was, and I don't care, but, relief for everybody, obviously. That's all good stuff. And the one last footnote I'll mention about the negotiations was he said, you want him to be here. That's the expectation. It's better for both parties if you get the deal done, which they did. But at the kind of tail end of just the contract discussions, he did say, yeah, there's a number, there's a level there. We prefer this, but he was comfortable going with the tag. So it at least makes you feel like, I think we assumed this was going to be the give from both sides. Daniel Jones mentioned when they said, the speculation around 45, 47, whatever the numbers were. He said, I'm not going to say what numbers were true or not true, just that I'm glad that the deal got done. It does make me at least think that first volley over the line there, whatever the ultimate goal was for Daniel Jones and his reps, it was a very significant number. The kind of number that if the Giants were saying, hey, 36 million a year, and Daniel Jones was saying 46 million a year, you can kind of get yourself to that 4-year 160 kind of territory by meeting in the middle on it. So both sides probably setting that standard early in these discussions. Here's the big one to me. Saquon Barkley mentioned about it. They're going to continue to talk with him. They're putting him on the tag, 10.1. They want to continue to negotiate long-term. He did say, it's funny, because in the old Joe Schoen can sometimes reveal something. Remember, weeks and weeks ago, even at the end of the season after the playoffs, Schoen said, Daniel Jones is going to be here long-term. It's just a matter of sorting it out. So here we are. They sorted it out. Likewise with Saquon, like he said, we want him to be here long-term, but we'll have to get into that room, that conversation. And he was asked about Saquon having said he would not be happy if he got tagged. This is the hold. The hold is the $10.1 million tag, and then trying to negotiate up from there and still get the long-term deal in place. It'll be interesting to see how that works out. I was just listening to a couple of conversations around running backs when we talk about their, as they get older, the production dropping off, but it's not a night and day drop off. They were using the example of LaDainian Tomlinson and how, hey, he could still give you at 28, 29 years old. He would still give you the flashes of some of that, the special plays. And then the everything else is still a very productive NFL running back, but it's that dynamic playmaking ability that you start to lose a little bit more of. And in that sense, the next couple of years for Saquon are going to be when you have those really big special opportunities, and then maybe it changes a little bit. And Saquon's a big running back, and maybe he can become a little bit more of a physical runner later on. So I think these two sides of how you want to get across the line with Saquon and projecting forward what he'll be. And I think that's probably a big part of those conversations. Unlike Daniel Jones, you say 4-year deal, continue to get better, continue to progress. Another contract can be coming down the pike when you're 30 years old. For Saquon, to me, you would think it's about, well, we want to keep you around. You're obviously valuable to Daniel Jones and to this offense in a huge way, but where are we going to be a couple years from now? And we know how contracts get structured in the NFL and how quickly it is to take those contracts and basically say, in the wind they go. They're not as valuable in terms of years as you may think. The big one for me was talking about getting some relief. So he was asked about Leonard Williams, about Kenny Golladay, and about some guys that are up for potentially on the fifth year pickup, which would be Dexter Lawrence, and what they anticipate there. So they said it's not official when it comes to Kenny Golladay that it's a post or pre-June 1. Joe Schoen talked about, yes, sometimes you'd rather just take your medicine now, which would be the pre-June 1, which comes with a bigger dead cap hit number. But then a year from now, you can see and feel that relief when you're trying to make decisions around the roster and where you're going to spend money. And he already said they have dead cap money on the books in 2024. So he already knows I've got some problems hanging out there for me that I'm going to have to navigate. Now, can I go, and maybe facilitate this in a way? They asked about Leonard Williams, and maybe it was just happenstance that he didn't get to it, but he didn't talk about the Leonard Williams situation at all. He did talk about Dexter Lawrence and saying he's on the fifth-year option, but he's a guy that we can have contract extension talks with, and then we can look at freeing up additional cap space that way as well, because we can transition this year's money into a signing bonus and bring that off the books too. So there'll be some opportunities for this team to get some other things done here, but I wonder if we all kind of thought that Lawrence was going to be that big primary one that could get done sooner. Andrew Thomas is going to be waiting there soon for that extension. And then other fringe guys. So specifically when they talked about the safety position, wasn't even Julian Love so much, but I think like McKinney got brought up, that number is going to come. But that was kind of the example when he talked about free agency and saying, the other part that you look at is, well, if it's a robust free agent market at the safety position and it's a deep draft class when it comes to safeties, well, then that can go ahead and bring the market value down. So maybe a guy like Julian Love that we've talked about and said, market value 8-9 million. But if you look around the league and other free agents and also project forward to the draft, maybe Julian Love's market is a little bit softened, and then bringing him back becomes much more viable because it's closer to, and no specific number, but it's closer to 7 than to 10, right? If you can do that on the average annual, maybe he still is an option on the table for this team that otherwise you wouldn't think. And all these things are predicated on having got this deal done with Daniel Jones and now being able to build out from there. The other thing that I think is interesting that they talk about with these contracts is what they can go and do on the market. So already you're seeing like Tampa Bay is doing some shedding here of contracts. The Titans did it earlier in this offseason as well. A lot of teams are going to be moving off some money here and then also flooding the market with some players as well. Who was the other team? Byron Jones for the Miami Dolphins. They've said that they're going to release him, going to give them over $13 million in cap relief. Where does he end up falling? And just how does he impact the market in free agency? I firmly believe, and there's a couple of different, I was just scrolling through some of the other ones that have gone on around this league, but I fully believe that Tremaine Edmonds is very much on the target board here for the Giants in free agency. Not because there isn't a lot of talent in the upcoming draft class, and not because we haven't seen how contracts and big contracts for the linebacker position, you don't want to overspend at that spot. But the Giants are so bereft of talent at that position. This feels like maybe the Glowinski signing, not in terms of talent, not in terms of expectations, not in terms of role, but in terms of, hey, we have glaring needs at certain spots on our roster. If we need to make sure that we go out and do one thing, that might be the play. And that's in totality when you think about, the wide receiver market's not going to be great here in this offseason in terms of free agency. So that feels like it's earmarked for the draft in order to make those moves. What goes on with Sterling Shepard, with Darius Slayton, with Richie James, with Marcus Johnson? I'm just naming all the guys that are going to be free agents. There's different levels of value you place on them. But, how does Joe Schoen treat those guys? How does the market treat those players? And if you're the Giants, and again, you're saying, yes, we want to go to the draft and we want to bring in, when they asked him about bringing in a number one wide receiver, this was directed at Daniel Jones. Was that a part of the negotiations of saying, yes, I'm back, I want to be here, with the understanding that you're going to go get me a number one wide receiver? Daniel Jones sidestepped that by saying, hey, I wanted to make sure I was back here, want to get to work. That'll all sort itself out. But it will be interesting how the Giants are approaching addressing these key areas of need. And if they feel confident going to the draft and saying, are there one or two players from 25 to 100, maybe to 128, that we feel really good about adding into our wide receiver core? And how do we look at the free agent market? How do we look at our cap situation? And which one of these guys among the four that I just mentioned there, primarily, let's talk about Darius Slayton, who was there playing, has been productive, has also struggled with drops. Richie James. Like, listen, is Richie James the greatest wide receiver in the world? No. But does Richie James have a functional role, and showed that even when you don't have a number one wide receiver out there on the field, he can still be productive. His game can look better if you bring in a true number one wide receiver. And if the price is right, maybe you get some veteran wide receiver value on him to get you through another year or two as you bring along the other guys. Some level of safety net needs to be put in place also around Wan'Dale Robinson, the injuries that he was struggling with in his rookie year, and whether or not you can feel confident that he's going to be able to get through 17 games. That's something that Andy brought up at the time of the draft. Small guy, you love what he can do, but can he stay healthy? So far, short sample size suggests that no, or at least it's going to be a concern, I should say, going forward. So it's interesting. I think that Tremaine Edmunds is very much a guy that's going to be on the radar here. You saw, Clark got released by the Chiefs. The tag goes for former New York Giant Evan Ingram down there with the Jacksonville Jaguars. He had, what would he go with? 766. The team's tight end in yardage, 766 yards, 4 touchdowns, 73 receptions. One of his best seasons in his NFL career. And that's something we talked about when the Giants moved on from him. NFL will reinstate Jaguars wide receiver Calvin Ridley. That becomes interesting, obviously. He's now with the Jacksonville Jaguars. Remember that? Remember this team that now with a new head coach and Trevor Lawrence all of a sudden looks like the top NFL draft pick that he was from a few seasons ago. Now he has Christian Kirk. Now he has Evan Ingram. Now he's going to have Calvin Ridley. Jacksonville Jaguars are coming in a big way. So very interesting. Tag over on Pollard in Dallas, obviously. Just these are ones that have happened here in and around what's gone on. Released the linebacker Floyd, obviously got released by the Rams. They have money problems there that they're trying to figure out. Kendricks in Minnesota, they released him. Didn't indicate where they got in terms of money saved on that. But so a lot of these moves are coming around the league and for the New York Football Giants as well. I'm going to be curious to see what happens with Dexter Lawrence and how that can help move the needle here for Big Blue when it comes to free agency and the number of mid to high level guys that the Giants can go target. We had also said, talking about the combine coming out of it and where some of these players stand in terms of targets for the New York Football Giants. I want to let's take just a little lap here around the wide receiver pool when we talk about the crop of players, how they were maybe impacted by the combine, and what it's going to look like going forward. So I'm actually going to go by ESPN just for the sake of argument. We use Draft Buzz a lot. I like that they'll collate a lot of different websites for you. But let's just go with best available for the upcoming draft class here, and then we'll get out the door. But I figure we all understand the contract has been signed. It's done. The next thing is Saquon Barkley long-term deal, a couple of extensions. The Giants are going to have moves to make here. And I will say that there does seem to be a marginal shift here in attitude around what this team wants to accomplish in this offseason as it relates to expectations going forward. So we'll talk more about that as it moves along. But a big part of that is really going to come down to what do they do in free agency? What do they do in the draft? How does it ultimately look? Wide receivers here, when we come through, and a couple of guys that I want to touch on, I'm curious to see if they improved anything on the write-up here. As it stands right now, I'll highlight the guys that I was interested in and that I think could be available. Rasheed Rice out of SMU, really a big fan of his. I think that he has the size, the strength, the route running ability, the consistent play that you would want to have there. I related him to kind of not being as quick twitchy as Sterling Shepard got over the course of his professional career. but a guy that's very similar in that way that you can rely on, that can make guys miss after the catch. He's 78th overall on the big board right now. I don't think it's unreasonable to look at him and say, this is a guy that I would take as high as 57. It just depends on what happens at 25 and how the Giants build their board. A guy in Jonathan Mingo that I mentioned before, he's 104. I think that he's a top 100 player by the time we get to the draft. A.T. Perry, again, 87th overall. Don't know if he falls to 89 or 100. That's an interesting one to think about too. The other guy that I'm still waiting here, and I think that by the time we talk about Andre Iosivas, we're going to be talking about him. 135 on the big board. I want to actually go and pull up his combine because I'm very curious to see. I didn't get a chance in real time to watch the wide receivers over the weekend. And then all this stuff started coming up, and you end up getting distracted on current conversations, free agency, and all those things. He participated in a drill during the NFL Combine, Lucas Oil Stadium. Let's see what we got here on him, because I'm just very curious. He's a guy that I've targeted right now. The projected grade on NFL.com puts him at a above average backup. And I remember, developmental, like pure athlete, hasn't been playing football a very long time. But the athleticism score puts him, by the way, okay. So these are the things that you like. Athleticism score for him, 9th out of all the wide receivers at the NFL Combine with a grade of 84. His production score is 37th. Now that's, again, because you have to consider where he's coming from at the collegiate level. But it puts him as the 20th best wide receiver in the upcoming draft with a grade of 73. And I only bring it up because he's currently listed as the 18th on the board. But if you went and looked at Marvin Mims out of Oklahoma, Demas Jr. out of Maryland, and then he's only he's 3 players back from Jonathan Mingo. Like, I'm very, very curious to see if the Giants try to attack this, the wide receiver position especially, understanding, yes, they want a true number one, but if one isn't there at 25 and now you're back to 57, I continue to think like 57 and then 89 or 100, can I compile 2 quality wide receivers that collectively inside of this system with Daniel Bellinger, with another tight end in this draft somewhere in the 128, 162 kind of range? If we bring those guys in here, we can give ourselves a great complement of weapons. That is, if you said that the totality of the weapons for Daniel Jones and the Giants offense, including Saquon Barkley, obviously, if the totality of those weapons this past season was at best, just bear with me here, a C-, right? A D+, C-. If we can get this to be a B- group, even that, a C+ group, even that marginal improvement of the floor means that down in distances, you're converting a couple more third downs. You're taking the top off of defenses a few more times. It's opening up the underneath routes, right? So I'm just very curious to see how they do it. We know number ones matter significantly, but you can't just go hog wild and say the 25th pick and other assets to move up the board to position X unless you feel like that wide receiver value is so cemented as being 99th percentile guaranteed to come in and be a true number one, that it makes it worth it for the Giants to make a move like that. Cy Guy Bry, who's first in the door here. Shea Tierney is our QB coach. He is great. Let's give him a day 3 QB draft pick to develop. Maybe we hit pay dirt in year 2. It would be a nice problem to have. I think so. I'll address this in the way that hopefully doesn't ruffle too many, staunchly Daniel Jones fans. It's never a bad thing to look at quarterbacks in the day 3 range and say, hey, let's get a guy into our system. Let's develop him and let's just have an asset, right? Let's create a happy problem to have where our backup QB, a young developmental QB, shows you something over the first couple of years. We know the Giants have taken swings on this and it's never worked out. We know that over the course of Eli Manning's career, it was far less critical because you were always so confident that he was going to be an Ironman and play every single game. Right now, we know it's going to be Daniel Jones. It's going to be Tyrod Taylor on the second year of his 2-year contract. But why not? Why not a guy there? Why not a QB at the back end of this draft that you just say, hey, listen, you'll be on the practice squad, you'll be developing. And if we can, excuse me, always get choked up talking about QBs. If we believe that you have a skill set that mirrors what this system desires, never hurts. And that's nothing to do with like what happens with Daniel Jones over the next 1, 2, 3, or 4 seasons. It's just you should always want to be doing that. You should always want to be putting yourself in a place to say, we have someone we could go to. Remember, the Patriots had Jimmy Garoppolo, and he filled in for an entire season when Tom Brady went down, and then went on to have other big contracts other places. But that saved a season for the New England Patriots when they otherwise could have been in a really hard spot, right? So it's something that I think is worth bringing up and seeing if the Giants choose to approach it that way. That being the case, I did a little bit of combine coverage last week. We know free agency is going to come up here. So looking at the free agency market matters, and seeing how things changed after the combine matters as well. So just a little bit of housekeeping for the podcast. Substack.com, Adam Armbrecht, AdamArmbrecht.substack.com. You go over there. I'm going to try to continue. It's just been a slow grind with everything that's been going on and other content, but I'm going to try to continue to do the write-ups on the players that I like. And now it'll be informed by the combine. So that'll move it a little bit, but I will, by the end of this week, beginning of next week, say, this is where this is the draft board that I like right now. And that'll consist of 25, 57, 89, 100, 162, and all the way back, and saying, hey, these are 2 to 3 players at 2 to 3 positions that I believe are real valuable targets for the Giants. Coming out of that combine, I loved what I saw from the edge rushing group. I think there's some versatility there. Some of those guys showed real zone drop back coverage ability that makes it enticing for the Giants to look at that group, look at the potentially deep class, and say, hey, if we want to have a backup, a guy that safeguards against Azeez Ojulari having injury concerns and just wanting to have more talent there. We know Ellerson Smith, who knows if he ever produces for us, right? But if we bring in a guy that can be a little bit of a backup edge rusher and a little bit of a coverage zone guy, all of a sudden you have that versatility for Wink Martindale. And then you go into the linebackers and on down the line. But it's going to be fun to look at that. I will say the guy that I was consistently mocking at 25 was Banks, the cornerback. He showed nothing at the combine to dissuade me of thinking if he's there at 25, man, do you elevate that secondary and Wink Martindale's ability for his desired scheme of, I want dudes man on man on the outside so I can bring the pressure on the quarterback. It's harder and harder to do that when you don't have that guarantee on the outside. We're fans of Cordell Flott. He has some versatility in terms of where you want to line him up. Holmes has fallen off, obviously, didn't have a good season for him. And Robinson, while we like him, hasn't been able to stay healthy. So if all of a sudden you could say, you go out and say you get a first-round cornerback, you have Flott, you still have Adoree Jackson, you have Xavier McKinney on the back end, you have Dane Belton back there, you can see how that secondary really can become one of the strengths potentially of this defense that affords that front seven to get after the QB in a far more consistent way in terms of production, getting home, right? Wink still threw a lot of blitzes out there. They just didn't get home as often as you wanted them to do. So we'll flesh out some of that stuff as well. I see you threw up another one here. All but one wide receiver is slot size this year in the draft at the top. Yeah, I'm sure Joe Schoen won't force wide receiver 25. Get your number one later in the draft. Yeah, and that's again why when I highlight the players that I'm talking about in terms of the wide receiver group. So, Jonathan Mingo, for example, is a player that you look at his measurables, the exact height here. And the more important one is really Rasheed Rice is the one that I really like, because Rasheed Rice is the exact measurables that you want. That actually kind of, it's funny. It actually comes back to something that we had talked about, say 2 years ago in draft classes, where I love big bodied wide receivers. I love the monsters, but we know that one, as they progress through their careers, they get a little bit, the speed drops down a little bit, the ability to get away, to separation speed, getting off the line, those things can get a little bit diminished. So striking that balance, even though he's listed, I'd had him at 6'2". They're labeling him at 6'1" right now. And by the way, he gets listed exactly the same as Andre does, they have him as talent or above average backup. the traits or talent to be an above average backup. I disagree with from what I've seen from him. I think he's developmental into a high level player for the wide receiver core, a very strong number 2, and with the right complement, you can label him the number 1 and then allow others to be productive off of that. And here's the reason why. So unlike when we talked about that other prospect who's an athlete, but has certainly a long way to go from a pure NFL wide receiver standpoint, production score, 8th overall at the combine, athleticism score, 7th overall at the combine, total score, 3rd overall at the combine for the wide receiver position. So don't sit here and tell me that when we talk about a player in Rasheed Rice that's listed as the 10th wide receiver on the board, I'm talking about a guy that's complement of traits, puts him very much in the conversation with any of the players that you're going to see from Josh Downs and beyond. So when we say I've got a guy in Rasheed Rice who's graded out of 78 and 78th overall, Cedric Tillman, 69th overall, very comfortable taking him ahead of him. Talk about Bout coming out of LSU, 62nd, comfortable going toe-to-toe and taking him over him. Reed out of Michigan State, 57, where the Giants pick, comfortable going in and pulling the trigger there. And then even Josh Downs, just speaking to Cy Guy there in terms of measurables, skill sets, I'm comfortable also taking certain wide receivers over others because I look at it and say the size, the strength, the NFL ready to contribute body that different wide receivers have, that's something I can get behind. And there's no way that if I'm the Giants, if I'm Joe Schoen, I can go back into the small wide receiver waters when I now have this sample size off of Wan'Dale Robinson that we want him to be productive. We think he can be, but we're already seeing the health concerns that really exist there. Let's go. I'm just going to quick here, check in on Jonathan Mingo, who I am a very big fan of. And I'm very curious just to see what his finals ended up being for the combine high profiles. Maybe I'll have to eat a little bit of crow here. Oh, guess what? I don't have to, because Jonathan Mingo, let's go ahead and give you the comp one last time here. This is the guy that I really like. Nay, he's the guy that I really love. Jonathan Mingo is ranked 104 overall and 15th in the wide receiver group. His now prospect grade following the combine is a 6.24. Will eventually be, that says average starter, so you can go ahead and take away from that what you will. But he's 6'2" listed there. So I think it was him, 6'2", 6'3", Rice, 6'1", 6'2", 220 pounds. Now, the production score is low. That's 21st. The athleticism score is high. That's 8th. And the overall puts him kind of right where they have him ranked on ESPN, 14th overall. But I love this guy. He ran now a 4.46 40, a 1.54, 10-yard split. The vertical was 39.5. I just 22 bench reps. There's just a lot to like about Jonathan Mingo. I don't know how high it has to go here. Most times when I run the mocks, he doesn't make it to 162, but you're really hard-pressed to take him at 100. Interesting to see how these draft boards start to develop over the next few weeks, because we could really start to get a sense of, hey, maybe we have an understanding about where he lands. By the way, the one thing I'll say about Iacivas is that I wanted to see his 40 time, 4.43. So not quite as fast as you might have wanted it to be. Just in terms of being a guy that is 6'3", can take the top off of a defense, has speed, but maybe not, we're talking about straight line speed versus NFL speed. That was the one there. And then let me just do another quick look here and see if I get Rasheed Rice, because I failed to mention this. 4.51 on his 40, vertical of a full 41 inches, by the way. That's a guy that goes up, can high point that football. So that's it. I know I ended up dipping way back into this well for the wide receiver room. But again, if you told me that you wanted to take Rasheed Rice at 57 and you wanted to take Jonathan Mingo, 128 would be perfect. If you want to take him at 128, I'd be very excited about the level of production and consistent production that you could get out of them, combined with Wan'Dale Robinson, with Daniel Bellinger, with a tight end, with Saquon out of the backfield, right? So going to be a lot of fun to have those discussions. When we do these lives, sometimes that's the way it goes. I trend in the direction of something else once we get through some of the nuts and bolts. The rest of this week, that's what it'll be. Talking about free agent targets, talking about how much money we think the Giants are going to be willing to spend and where they should try to spend it, and how it'll impact what they do in the draft, specifically from, if it's a weak draft class, let's attack it in free agency even more aggressively than we might otherwise do. So stay tuned for all of that. The other thing is, anybody in here on the live, I appreciate you. I appreciate every single person that comes in for these. Daniel Jones is obviously, officially, if there was a doubt, the franchise quarterback for the Giants for the next 4 years, a 4-year, $160 million contract with a very low first-year cap hit that affords Joe Schoen flexibility. And it means now that this offense specifically can plug and play some key pieces that hopefully give us a season ahead that we wanted to see a little bit more of this past year, right? Second year with Kafka, second year with Dable. Get some weapons in there, shore up that offensive line, and let's have this team be a team that week in, week out can be producing 20 plus points per game, 22, 24. Let's be one of the more dangerous teams in the league on the offensive side of the ball. It'll only help what you ask of that defense in Wink Martindale. Get us over on YouTube where you are right now. Subscribe, turn on the alerts, share it with your friends. Get over where you get your podcast needs fulfilled also as well. And then Adam Armbrecht over on Substack. We'll continue to try to pump out those articles. And if you're a fan of other things around sports in general, there's going to start to be some content over there that you don't have to absorb. Only take it if you want it. It's like a buffet of content around the New Jersey Devils, some stuff around the Brooklyn Nets, obviously, with the Locked On Nets podcast will be going up, and even some MLS coverage. I know we get a little bit of, you get some wide-ranging coverage. And if you're a pure Giants fan or you're just a fan of a different team in one of those other sports, it's all good. But that's what I'll be up to. And yes, Cy Guy Bry, by the way, one of the key things that I'll be focusing on is strengthening the middle of that defense, both on the defensive line and through that linebacking core, developing complementary pieces that can help shore up specifically the putrid run defense that was Big Blue in 2022-23. Everybody have a great day. It's a Wednesday. We'll be back in by the end of the week. Thanks so much for joining us here live on YouTube. And as Andy Mackowitz would want, need, and nay, always demand, you the people know. Let's go Big Blue. Yeah, dude, bro.